So I will now introduce Tony, who will get our day started. So Tony Hall graduated from King's College London with first-class honours in physiology and pharmacology before going on to study medicine at the Royal Free Hospital. He joined the pharmaceutical industry in 1994 and has significant experience in clinical and regulatory development of drugs for rare diseases. He speaks regularly at rare disease conferences, is an author of a number of articles on orphan drugs, and is a member of the IRC working group on orphan drug development and regulatory processes. So Tony is also the co-founder of Findacure, to which he devotes most of his time and also provides pro bono advice to the AKU Society, who will also be speaking. And the rest of his time he works as a consultant providing advice and guidance on the development of orphan drugs to the biopharmaceutical industry. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks very much, Flora. I'm going to talk to you about planning a clinical trial. And I just start by saying that planning a good clinical trial is really, really hard. Planning a good clinical trial for a rare disease is really exceptionally hard. And why is that? Well, it's because there's a lot of different considerations that you need to consider. You need to consider regulatory components, clinical components, logistical components, and of course with rare diseases there's a whole bunch of other things as well that make it very difficult. So what I'm planning to do in this short presentation is just to take you through some of the key things that you need to think about if you're designing a clinical trial for a rare disease. So normally when I do this talk, I'm normally giving it to people who are working in the pharmaceutical industry, taking them through the regulatory components, some of the specific challenges for orphan drug studies. Biomarkers and surrogate endpoints, I think, are really important as well to touch upon for rare diseases studies. And then some of the sort of practical and logistical issues. So I'm going to go through those points as well today. But I think it's because you're mostly not within the pharma industry, I think it's also important just to point out at the outset that a clinical trial needs to be part of an overall development program. And something that I've often seen, particularly with clinical trials that have been initiated by academia, is that they sort of see getting to the clinical trial as kind of being their objective. So they do the research, they have the invention, and then they get it into the clinic. And the clinical trial that happens is often not really well thought through and doesn't really have a particular place in a development program. So often what's happened is they've just do a clinical trial, and at the end of that, it doesn't necessarily help you to get your drug to the market or to reach patients, which of course is the ultimate objective of what you want to do. So please remember, if you're talking to researchers and academics about a clinical trial, that it does need to be part of a program, and the objective of that program is to get a drug approved so that patients can receive the treatment, and that's really important consideration at the beginning. In order to do that, you do need some expert advice, and usually that's well worth paying for early on because it'll really pay off, it'll really pay dividends at the end. And don't underestimate the complexity and the time and the cost. Clinical trials are very expensive, they're very complex to run, and in rare diseases in particular where you have a few patients in one or two countries, often the logistics involved in running these programs can be extremely hard and much harder than running a clinical trial in something like diabetes or hypertension or any of the really common conditions. And the other thing that actually struck me a bit when I came into this rare diseases area was be prepared for a lot of obstructions along the way. You sort of assume that everybody will have your passion and your commitment to make it all happen. But actually that's not the case. A lot of people along the way really don't care, and they have their job to get the stamp from the hospital or the signature of the director from the university or whatever, and that's what they do. And it doesn't matter to them that everything is delayed and everything's taking longer. So if you know that at the beginning, it will really help, A, to stop you from being disappointed, but also to help you to plan for those things right from the outset and to expect those kind of things to happen. This is just a short list of some of the specific challenges with designing orphan drug studies. What I'm going to do just now is to run through each of those in a little bit of detail. So one of the first things is that often for rare diseases there's no animal model. So that makes it very difficult to study potential drug candidates. Normally with traditional drug development, you would normally start by studying your drug candidates in an animal model. And for the common diseases, there are usually good animal models that allow you to do that. So you can screen a lot of different potential molecules, and you can hone those down to the ones that seem to be the most effective. Then you can do your toxicity screening, and one or two of those might make it into humans. But when you don't have an animal model, it's really hard to do that. So often, and it's often quite difficult to do toxicity testing as well, particularly if you have something like a gene therapy, which may be very specific for humans, and the action in animals might be very different from what you would see in humans. The other thing is that it might, because if there's no animal model, it might preclude an early application for orphan designation, which is something that you might really need, because quite often that is something that you have to get early on in order to get funding, or in order, for example, to go for scientific advice and get free scientific advice, you have to have orphan designation first, otherwise you have to pay for it. But in order to get orphan designation, you do need to have some experimental data. But if you don't have an animal model, how do you get the experimental data? So that can also make life quite challenging. And it is really important to try to get that animal model early on. One of the things that Nick did with his AKU project was, with some of the first money they raised, was to set up an animal model so that they could get that process going and they could test potential drug candidates in the animal model. Often the natural history of the disease is also not well known for rare diseases. For some of the more rare diseases, it may just be a few case studies in the literature. And that makes it really hard to plan your clinical program, because if you don't know what the natural course of the disease is, then you also don't really know what endpoints you should think of for your clinical trials, or even how to really measure whether a product might be working well or not. How do you decide on what is a good magnitude of effect if you don't really know what the natural course of the disease is? So doing a natural history study early on in the development program is actually really important. And quite often these things happen much, much later in a program. But actually, if you've got that under your belt at the beginning, if you've got your animal model in your natural history study, then you've got a really good basis and a really good foundation on which to build the rest of your development and your clinical program. The other thing is that there's often a lack of an established regulatory paradigm. And by this, what I mean is that the regulators officially, and perhaps a bit surprisingly, officially they require the same level of evidence for orphan drugs, for rare diseases, as they do for any other drug. So I know there have been many examples of orphan drugs that have been approved with actually quite limited development programs, but the official line is still that you still need to prove a positive benefit-risk ratio, and you still need to be able to show the efficacy of the product. And that can be really hard with small studies and small patient populations. A lot of people, I think, have the idea that orphan drugs are automatically eligible for some of these expedited processes, but that's not really the case. You have to argue these on a case-by-case basis, and the legislation is not really specific for orphan drugs, even though it may apply more commonly to orphan drugs. Just to mention what a couple of these are, conditional marketing authorization is something that we see sometimes for orphan drugs, and this is basically where you get, it's a kind of adaptive licensing where you get an early approval based on the data that you've been able to provide, and the regulators say, okay, we recognize that this is not all the data that we would like to see, so we're going to give you a conditional or provisional license, and then we expect you to go off and collect more data and come back. Usually they will reassess your license after a year and then perhaps again after another year, but the idea is that this should be then converted into a full license once you've collected the data. And they'll do this if they think that a product has real promise and that they want to get it available for patients as soon as possible. Then there's marketing authorization under exceptional circumstances, which is where the regulators understand that you probably will never be able to collect sufficient data, what they would normally like to see, but they say, okay, this is a rare disease. We understand that this is as much as we're ever going to see. So under exceptional circumstances, we'll give you this marketing authorization. And that's a kind of full license. It's not a conditional license. Adaptive licensing is something which is a bit of a buzz phrase at the moment, but it is a kind of conditional licensing. The idea is that to try to get products to patients much, much earlier in the development path than they would normally be, and then to adapt the license as you go. And the European Medicines Agency is really keen on this. They've actually just launched an adaptive licensing program specifically to encourage companies to come and try to get their program approved for adaptive licensing. It's really something that's worth thinking about if you get to that stage, because it means that you can often get funding for the first part of a program, get the products to the patients early on, and then once it's on the market, then you collect more data and build your license as you go. And then some of you also probably know about the Early Access to Medicine scheme, which is a UK-specific thing. Then often there's a lack of accepted clinical efficacy measures. The Medicines Agency published guidelines for a lot of conditions that help you to develop programs, to develop products for certain diseases. But for rare diseases, that's not the case. Quite often this will be the first product that's ever been developed for that condition. So of course there's no guidelines. So that means that neither you nor the regulators know what efficacy measures you should be thinking about, and especially if there's no natural history study either, it can be really hard. So, and if you don't identify the right endpoints, your clinical program can completely fail. So this is something that has to be sorted out very early on, and preferably agreed with the regulators as well very early on, so that they have a complete buy-in, they understand what it is that you're doing, and that the program that you're doing makes some sense. I should just mention quickly about scientific advice and protocol assistance. So protocol assistance is scientific advice for orphan drugs, but it's actually exactly the same process as scientific advice, and it's given by the Scientific Advice Working Party. Don't really know why they came up with a new name for it, but there we are. And you can do this either centrally or locally. If you go centrally to the European Medicines Agency, then you get a decision which is basically valid for the whole of Europe. It's not legally binding, by the way. It's not like FDA advice, but it is a pretty good guide. At least if you don't do what they suggest, then you better have a pretty good reason for that later on. And if you do what they suggest, then they would also need to explain to you why that wasn't acceptable, I think. So they put together a working party, and you basically go and ask your questions about the clinical trial design, the development program. You can ask questions anything from quality and manufacturing through regulatory and clinical. And it's relatively short. I'll show you in the next slide how long that takes. You can also go for local advice, and the local agencies like the MHRA will also provide a similar kind of scientific advice. But of course, it's a bit more informal, but it's only the MHRA can only speak for themselves, of course. So just because they tell you something, it doesn't necessarily mean that the EMA will accept that later. So the European Medicines Agency. So the local scientific advice is a bit more informal, but it's only a local advice that you're getting. So sometimes what people do, they go for one or two local advice and then go to the EMA afterwards. Personally, I think that if you're clear about what your questions are that you have, then let's just go straight to the EMA. And it's free, by the way, if you have orphan designation. I won't bore you with this slide, but just to give you an idea of the kind of timelines for that, it's all very fixed. You have to submit a letter of intent a certain number of days before your submission. Then you do your submission. Then there's a clock start. Then they have a meeting about it. And you should get an opinion at day 40. And if you don't get an opinion at day 40, then that can continue on to day 70. But then it's finished. So you know in advance that it's a fixed period of time. I think it's worth mentioning a bit about surrogate endpoints as well, because these can be quite important for rare diseases. Usually it's going to be impossible to do large outcome studies for rare diseases, which is what the regulators favor for most clinical trials. But you need to, if you're going to try to use a surrogate endpoint, and I'll explain what that is exactly in a moment, then you need to be really sure about your choice of surrogate. So just to explain a couple of terms. So a biomarker is an indicator of a biological or pathological process or a pharmacological response to a therapeutic intervention. And one that springs to mind that is common is cholesterol and statins. So hypercholesterolemia is a kind of biomarker, and your cholesterol goes down in response to treatment, for example, with statins. Then a surrogate endpoint is where you use the biomarker as a substitute for a clinical endpoint, say for a clinical program. So a clinical endpoint would be dying or being alive. And that is a great endpoint because it's not very subjective. So that's the one the regulators really like, but usually you can't do that mainly because it just takes too long and you need a lot of people. So the idea is to use a surrogate endpoint, so a biomarker, as a substitute for a clinical endpoint, as a way of monitoring the progress of the condition in your treated and your untreated groups in your clinical program. And the great thing about these is that, first of all, it's quick. So clinical endpoints can take years and years and need lots and lots of patients. But with surrogates, you can often do it quite quickly with quite small numbers. The variability is usually much less with surrogates. So that makes, from a statistics point of view, you actually need smaller numbers in order to show a statistically significant difference. So it often makes it possible to do a clinical program that you actually couldn't do otherwise. So what are the problems with some of these? Well, the thing is that a lot of surrogates are of questionable clinical relevance. They may seem obvious. It may seem obvious that this surrogate will be a good marker for a particular clinical outcome, but you have to prove it somehow. And this can often be really difficult to do. And the regulators are really keen on this because there have been some cases in the past where surrogate markers have proven not to be collated with a clinical endpoint in the way that people assume that they would be. So they're quite cautious about this. So if you want to use a surrogate, you have to get this approved. And this is a quote from Dr. Temple, who used to be with the FDA, that there's no surrogate for safety. And safety, of course, is what is the regulator's main concern. So they're happy for you to use surrogates, but they want to be sure that your product is safe. So you need to work into your program that you can demonstrate safety at the same time as being able to show an effect on your surrogate. So what you need to do, you need to validate these surrogates. And that can be easy or it can be very difficult. So with the example of the cholesterol, for example, there have been many studies that have shown that the level of cholesterol is directly linked to the incidence of heart disease and death. So you've got a very nice proof there that the two are linked. But it's not always easy to do that. And especially if nobody's ever done it before, so you're doing this for the first time, how do you study that? How do you gather the data on this? And this again then comes back to the natural history studies, where perhaps during your natural history study, you may be able to collect, if you're thinking about using a certain surrogate, you may be able to collect data on that while you're studying the natural history of the condition and link the two things together. Statistical tools can be also something of an issue for small studies. So statistics are based basically on the idea that when you do a clinical trial, you're taking a sample, and that sample is a sample of a much bigger population. And the bigger the sample, the more power you have in your statistics. So that's why clinical trials often tend to be quite big. But if you can only do a small clinical trial, then of course it can be really, really difficult to be able to show statistical significance. So because of that, you have to speak with the regulators You have to get your point across to the regulators that you want to do a clinical trial that may not show statistical significance, but still get them to approve your product. And that's, of course, the real key with going for the scientific advice and getting them to understand what you're doing, and that perhaps the normal statistical approach is not valid in this particular case. You need to design realistic studies as well. There's no point in designing a really fancy clinical trial. Academics are great at doing this, designing really complex clinical trials that then are totally impractical and you don't recruit any patients. because that doesn't really help anybody. I think it's very, very important to involve patient organizations early on. So for pharmaceutical companies to open that dialogue very early on will be very beneficial. And there are one or two specialist companies around that do specialize in running these kind of studies. So good to perhaps involve one of those as well. Specialist centers are obviously also very important, and I think that that's something that as patient organizations, you're probably already identifying the key opinion leaders and the key specialist centers. And as the centers of excellence also start to become more of a thing, then these can also represent a good basis as a good place to be able to do your clinical trial, where you can get the experts and the patients all in one place. And then there's a whole bunch of ethical issues to take into consideration as well, which is always true for all clinical trials, but perhaps again in the rare diseases field, where a lot of the time it's children that you're talking about, you have special ethical considerations in that case. It may be very, very hard to have a control arm in a study, even if you have a drug that is not, where you don't know really whether it works or not. Still, everybody wants to be on the treatment, especially if this is a condition that is potentially fatal. Then nobody wants to be in the control arm. And these can be very, very difficult issues to take into account when you're designing your clinical trials. So basically, to summarize, as I said, the regulators do require the same level of evidence of benefit risk for rare diseases as they do for normal drugs. So you have to bear that in mind when you're designing your program. It can be very hard to provide that kind of evidence, so you have to be quite innovative in your thinking and in the way you design your programs. The regulators can be quite flexible, but you need to convince them that what you're planning to do is acceptable from a regulatory and a statistics point of view. And you need to think innovatively about this. You need to have an early dialogue with the regulators and get their buy-in to the program very early on. So, thank you very much.